The wood was wet. That's what nearly finished the Hartley family. Not the cold itself, not the blizzard that came rolling in off the Judith Basin on the 3rd of January 1879, dropping 17 inches of snow in 11 hours and hammering the temperature down to 38 degrees below zero. What almost killed them was wet wood. 3 cords of ponderosa pine stacked 6 feet from their cabin door, every stick of it soaked through from 4 days of freezing rain before the cold snapped hard. When August Hartley crawled out of his bunk that morning, when he pulled on his boots with fingers already going numb and stumbled to the woodpile and grabbed an armful of frozen ice-rimed pine and brought it inside and started shaving kindling into the firebox, the wood wouldn't catch. Not even close. He shaved for an hour. He used the last of his lamp oil as a starter. He burned an old ladder-back chair that his wife Dora had carried 900 miles from Missouri in the back of a wagon. He burned a wooden crate that had held her mother's china. He sat back when those were gone and listened to the wind working at the gaps between the logs and made a kind of peace with something that no 32-year-old man ought to ever have to make peace with. Dora was in the corner with the 2 girls, all 3 of them wrapped in every blanket and quilt and piece of wool clothing they owned. And she wasn't crying and she wasn't praying out loud, which told August more about how bad things were than anything else could have. Dora Hartley prayed out loud in hard times. The fact that she'd gone quiet meant she'd already calculated the odds and didn't much like the answer. The older girl, Clara, was 9 years old and she understood enough to keep still. The younger one, Ruth, was 4 years old and she'd stopped asking when breakfast was going to be ready, which was the most frightening thing of all. The cabin was 18 by 20 feet of lodgepole pine with a dirt floor and a sod roof and 1 small window on the south wall, and the temperature inside it that morning dropped from a tolerable 22 degrees at first light to somewhere around 4 degrees above zero by mid-morning. 4 degrees above zero with the fire dead and the wind outside running at 30 miles an hour and no neighbor closer than 6 miles and the snow already so deep that the mule in the lean-to was belly level in it. August Hartley had built himself a good house by the standards of the Judith Basin in 1878. He'd done everything right. And he was going to watch his family freeze to death inside it because the wood he'd stacked and counted on was wet and there wasn't a dry stick left in 40 miles that he could reach. What saved them came from the west at just past noon. They heard it before they saw it, the creak and jingle of a loaded sledge, and then the muffled thud of a horse that had no business being out in that weather, being urged through a 4-foot drift against the north wall of the cabin. Then a fist hammering on the door. Then the voice of Eric Halverson, their nearest neighbor, shouting through 6 inches of solid pine. "August, open up, I brought wood." He'd come 6 miles through the worst blizzard in 12 years. He was driving a Norwegian fjord horse named Sigrid that stood 14.5 hands and weighed 1,100 pounds and had the cold weather sense that God gave mountain horses, and he was hauling a sledge loaded with 230 pounds of split lodgepole pine, every stick bone dry. Not surface dry, not dry on the outside with wet running through the grain. Bone dry, 14% moisture content or less, the kind of dry that catches from a single match and burns hot and long and gives off twice the heat of green or rain-soaked wood. The kind of dry that saves lives. They got the fire going in 11 minutes. By 2 o'clock that afternoon, the cabin was 61 degrees, and Dora Hartley was making cornmeal mush on the stovetop, and little Ruth was asking again when breakfast was going to be ready, which was the best sound August Hartley had ever heard in his life. He sat across the table from Eric Halverson and watched the Norwegian drink coffee and warm his hands and said, "Where in the hell did you get dry wood like that in January?" Halverson set down his cup. He wasn't a man who used a lot of words, never had been, not in Norwegian and not in English. He thought for a moment and said, "Under my floor." Well, if you're watching this channel for the first time, what you're about to hear is the story of how one Norwegian immigrant on the Montana frontier spent 120 days building something that most of his neighbors thought was either crazy, dangerous, or a waste of good digging energy, and how that thing saved at least 2 lives the first winter it was used. Before we get into how he built it, take a moment and subscribe to this channel. We're here to preserve the practical knowledge that kept frontier families alive, the techniques that don't show up in textbooks, the things that got passed down through families and then got lost when the families moved to cities and stopped needing to know them. If that kind of knowledge matters to you, and I think it does, or you wouldn't be here, hit subscribe. Help us keep these stories alive. Eric Halverson had come to Montana Territory in 1870, 8 years before the winter that nearly killed the Hartleys. He'd crossed from Norway at the age of 19, worked the docks in Baltimore for 2 years, then followed the railroad west through Ohio and Indiana and Illinois until he ended up in Minnesota, where he worked a timber crew for 3 years before something in him said to keep going. He arrived in the Judith Basin in the spring of 1870 with $47, a Norwegian-German dictionary he'd never quite finished reading, a broad axe that had belonged to his father, and a memory. The memory was of his grandfather's farm in Telemark County in the high country of south-central Norway. The farm sat in a valley that got hard winters, not Montana hard but hard enough, and his grandfather, a spare and unsmiling man named Torgeir, had built his farmhouse over a cellar, which is the Norwegian word for a cellar dug into the ground beneath the structure itself, not beside the house, not separated by 20 feet of open ground, under it. The floor of the cellar was 6 feet below the surface of the earth, and the roof of the cellar was the floor of the house above. And what Torgeir kept down there was everything he couldn't afford to lose to moisture or freeze-thaw cycles. Root vegetables, yes, but also dried fish, salt pork in crocks, seed grain in sealed barrels, and this was the part that stuck in young Eric's memory. Fuel, carefully bundled peat bricks, dried dung cakes, split birchwood, packed tight and covered with a woolen cloth. The old man had understood something that a lot of people in a lot of places had to figure out through painful experience. That fuel stored underground, insulated from weather by 6 feet of earth and protected from precipitation by the floor overhead, stayed dry in a way that no surface woodpile ever could. Montana wasn't Norway, but the Judith Basin winters came close enough to make Halvorsen wonder if the principle translated. He'd built his cabin in the summer of 1870 on a quarter section south of Warm Springs Creek, on a slight rise that gave him good drainage and a clear view of the snowy mountains 40 miles to the south. He'd built it solid, 16 by 22 feet of lodgepole pine notched at the corners in the Scandinavian fashion, with a good stone fireplace on the north wall and a sleeping loft above. But he hadn't built the cellar that first year, or the second or the third. He didn't have the time, and he wasn't sure the idea would work, and he was alone on that quarter section for most of those early years, which meant every hour he spent on something that didn't produce immediate food or income was an hour he couldn't spend on something that did. You don't get to be philosophical about long-term storage when you're not sure you're going to make it through the immediate season. What changed his thinking was the winter of 1874. That year, Halvorsen lost 40% of his firewood to a 2-week period of alternating thaw and freeze in late November. He'd put up 6 cords, more than enough, he'd thought, and the weather came in warm and wet for 10 days, soaking the outer layers of every pile, and then dropped hard, and when he split open the frozen logs in December, he found water-damaged wood that burned cold and smoky and left his cabin at 40 degrees on the worst nights. He didn't freeze. He came close enough. And that spring, when the ground thawed, he started planning. He didn't start digging until August of 1878. 4 years of planning. That's not laziness, that's a careful man working out a problem he knew he only got one chance to solve correctly. The first person to tell Erik Halvorsen he was making a mistake was Cornelius Brandt, and Cornelius had earned the right to have an opinion about frontier construction. He was 53 years old in 1878, a German-born carpenter who'd been in Montana since 1866, and he'd built or helped build 31 cabins, 2 churches, a mill, and a 2-story mercantile in the town of Lewistown. He was not a man who spoke carelessly about structure. When he came by Halvorsen's place in mid-August and watched the Norwegian measuring out the floor of his cabin with a string line and a wooden stake, Brandt crossed his arms and said, in the measured way he had of talking, "You're not doing what I think you're doing." Halvorsen told him what he was doing. Brandt uncrossed his arms and recrossed them the other way and was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's your foundation you're disturbing. Those cornerstones are sitting on hard pan. You dig out the middle, you change the load distribution, you get settlement, you get cracking in the log walls. Maybe you get failure in the joints. I've seen it happen." He paused. "I've seen it happen to men who knew what they were doing." This was a legitimate concern. Cornelius Brandt wasn't being contrary for the sake of it. He was speaking from 12 years of practical experience in a territory where structural failures didn't just mean a repair bill. They meant a family sleeping in a leaking, collapsing building through a Montana winter. He had watched a soddy in the Musselshell Valley collapse under a snow load because the owner had dug a potato pit too close to the central support post. He'd watched a log cabin in the Belt Creek country develop a 3-inch crack along its north wall because somebody had excavated for a storm shelter without understanding how the cornerstones distributed the weight of the structure above. He was right to be worried. Halvorsen listened. He didn't argue. He thanked Brandt and went inside and came back out with a piece of paper on which he'd drawn a cross-section of what he intended to build, showing where the excavation would be and where it wouldn't, showing how he planned to leave a 12-inch shelf of undisturbed hardpan running the perimeter of the excavated area, how the cornerstones would not be touched, how the new support posts he intended to set in the excavated area would actually increase the structural support of the floor above, rather than compromise the foundation. He handed the paper to Brandt and waited. Brandt studied it for a long time. He turned it sideways. He handed it back and said, "That might work." Coming from Cornelius Brandt, that was as close to enthusiasm as a man was likely to get. The second skeptic was a woman named Marta Szymanski, a Polish immigrant who'd come to the Judith Basin in 1875 with her husband Tomasz, a skilled joiner and cabinet maker who died of typhoid fever in the summer of 1876, leaving her with 2 teenage sons and 160 acres and a stubbornness that had kept all 3 of them alive for 2 years since. Marta Szymanski knew wood. She'd grown up watching her father work in a Warsaw carpentry shop, had learned to read grain and moisture and quality the way some people read faces. When she heard what Halvorsen was planning, she rode over and listened to him explain it and said in her careful, accented English, "Underground is wet. Wet underground, wet wood. You are putting your wood in a hole to make it more wet, not less." She wasn't wrong as a general principle. Subsurface excavations in the Judith Basin often did collect moisture, seepage from the water table, condensation from temperature differentials, runoff from rain and snowmelt. If Halvorsen simply dug a hole under his cabin and stacked wood in it, he'd end up with a damp wood cellar that produced moldy, unusable fuel inside of one winter. Marta had seen the same principle destroy more root cellars than she could count. Men who dug without understanding drainage, who piled vegetables in holes that turned into shallow wells every spring. She said, "I know 3 men who tried to keep potatoes underground and had soup by February. Different kind of soup than they wanted." Halvorsen appreciated her saying it out loud because it forced him to explain the drainage system he'd designed, which was the most technically complex part of the whole project and the part that he'd spent the most time thinking through. He told her about the 4-inch layer of crushed gravel he planned to lay at the bottom of the excavation, and the 2-inch layer of coarse sand above that and the slightly sloped floor, a 3-degree grade running toward a drainage channel at the north wall that would carry any water that got in away from the stacked wood and toward a French drain he intended to dig along the outside foundation of the north wall. He told her about the raised wooden pallets he'd built to keep the bottom layer of firewood 6 inches above the gravel, ensuring air circulation underneath the pile. He told her about the ventilation, a small gap at the top of the access hatch that would allow moist air to escape upward into the heated cabin above, using the heat of the living space as a passive drying mechanism. Marta listened to all of it. She was quiet for a while. Then she said, "You have thought about this for a long time." 4 years, Halvorsen said. She looked at the cabin and then back at him and said, "Show me where you plan to put the drainage channel." The third skeptic was the most vocal and the most wrong and the most interesting in how he got there. Captain Randolph Whitmore, he insisted on the title, though the army had discharged him in 1872, was a former cavalry officer who'd settled on a quarter section 3 miles north of Halvorsen's place, and who had, in his 6 years on the frontier, developed strong opinions about everything and a conviction that those opinions were earned by experience rather than generated by temperament, which was a distinction he made about himself that his neighbors didn't always share. Whitmore heard about Halvorsen's project from Cornelius Brandt and rode over on a Tuesday morning in late August and stood with his thumbs hooked in his vest pockets and watched Halvorsen mark out the excavation line with chalk powder on the floorboards and said, "You're going to dig under your floor." Halvorsen confirmed that he was. In August, Halvorsen confirmed that too. Whitmore said, "I've organized the field construction of 47 earthworks in 3 different territories, and I will tell you that digging in August in the Judith Basin is asking for trouble. You get the afternoon thunderstorms, you get the flash flooding, you open up a hole under your floor in August and you're going to fill it with water before you can brace the walls." He said this with the confidence of a man who'd watched a lot of ill-conceived digging projects collapse, which was, to be fair, a thing that had happened with some frequency in his military career. What you want is to dig in October. Ground still workable, rains mostly done. This was actually the most technically sound objection anyone raised. August in central Montana does bring afternoon thunderstorms, and Halvorsen's plan required him to have the cabin floor open and the excavation exposed for at least 6 to 8 weeks before he could install the gravel drainage layer and the wooden floor supports, There was a real risk of flooding the pit. Whitmore wasn't wrong about that. He was wrong about what the alternative was, because digging in October would have left Halverson with an unfinished, unsheltered excavation going into November, which was far worse. And the fourth voice of skepticism came from the most unexpected quarter. Pastor Elias Drummond ran the small non-denominational congregation that met on alternating Sundays at the Szymanski homestead. Martha had offered her parlor, and the gesture had stuck. And he was not a foolish man, and not a mean one, and he came to Halverson not with objections, but with a question that carried its own kind of weight. He said, "Eric, how much of your summer and fall are you going to give to this project?" Halverson said he reckoned the whole thing, start to finish, would take about 120 days. Drummond said, "That's 4 months, from August through November. That's your harvest time and your hunting season and the time you put up your winter stores. You're a single man, no family. You can do it if you push hard. But what if something goes wrong? What if you're 60 days into a 4-month project and you've got a half-finished pit under your floor and the weather closes in? Then you've got neither the pit nor the firewood nor the stores, and you're in a hard spot." He paused. He was a man who chose his pauses carefully. "I'm not saying don't do it. I'm saying count the cost first." Halverson thanked him and thought about it for 3 days. Then he started digging. The first shovelful came out on August the 11th, 1878, a Monday morning, with the temperature at 64 degrees and a light south wind. Halverson had moved his furniture out of the cabin and into a canvas-covered stack beside the lean-to. He'd pulled up the floorboards. He'd laid the floor in 1872 out of rough-sawn pine planks, 1¼ inches thick, 16 inches wide, and he pried them up carefully because he intended to relay them when the project was done. He numbered each one on its underside with a wood-burning iron so he could put them back in order. Cornelius Brandt had told him that was unnecessary. Halverson did it anyway. What he found under the floor was what he'd hoped to find. A layer of packed clay about 4 inches deep, then hardpan, compressed gravel and clay, running down at least 3 feet before he hit the water-bearing layer he'd located by probing with a steel rod the previous spring. The hardpan was good news. It meant the walls of his excavation would hold without heavy shoring. It meant the floor of the pit would be stable enough to work on without constantly reinforcing. It meant his drainage design was probably going to work because hardpan doesn't absorb water the way sandy soil does. It deflects it, which meant water would move along the surface toward his drainage channel rather than seeping into the walls. He laid out the excavation with chalk lines on the hardpan. 12 feet by 14 feet centered in the cabin, leaving the required 12-inch shelf around the perimeter. That gave him 168 square feet of floor space in the pit, roughly equivalent to the kitchen area of a modest frontier home. He intended to dig it down 6 feet from the cabin floor, which would put the pit floor at about 8½ feet below the surface of the ground outside. 6 feet was the magic number his grandfather's Keller had used, and it was the depth at which central Montana's ground temperature stabilized at around 48 to 52 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. Deep enough to stay above freezing, shallow enough to dig without hitting the water table. Deep enough to insulate the stored wood from the wild temperature swings above ground, where summer highs hit 90 degrees and winter lows hit 40 below. A swing of 130 degrees that was catastrophic for stored wood, but would be almost entirely eliminated 6 feet underground. He dug alone for the first 10 days. This was the hardest part. The hard pan was tough going. A pick and a spade, 20 strokes with the pick to loosen what one bite of a spade could remove, and the spoil had to be carried out in a wooden bucket, up a ramp he'd built of planks leaning against the cabin's south wall, and dumped 20 feet out to the east where it wouldn't interfere with drainage. He moved 512 cubic feet of earth. That's approximately 19 tons if you're counting. He moved it in a bucket that held about 40 pounds per load. He made somewhere in the neighborhood of 950 trips up that ramp before the excavation was done. Marta Szymanski's older son, Piotr, 17 years old and built like a young ox, started showing up to help on the 12th day without being asked. He didn't say much about why he was there. He just picked up the second spade and started digging. Halverson paid him 30 cents a day in cornmeal and dried beans, which was the currency available. By the time Piotr Szymanski joined the project, they were 4 feet down, and the walls of the excavation were holding clean and straight, and the hardpan was proving itself exactly as good as Halverson had hoped. The drainage system went in when they hit 5 feet of depth. 4 inches of crushed limestone gravel across the entire floor. Halverson had spent 2 weeks the previous summer breaking limestone with a hammer and sorting it to rough consistency, stockpiling almost a ton of the material. Then 2 inches of coarse creek sand on top of that, leveled carefully with a straight edge board. Then the drainage channel. a shallow trench, 4 inches wide and 4 inches deep, running along the base of the north wall, sloped at a consistent 3 degrees toward the northeast corner, where Halvorsen had already dug the French drain outside. The French drain was a trench 40 inches deep and 4 feet long, filled with gravel, positioned to receive any water that came down the drainage channel through a 4-inch clay pipe he'd set in the north foundation wall. The clay pipe had been the single most expensive component of the whole project. He'd ordered it from a hardware supplier in Fort Benton and paid $2.40 for 4 linear feet of it, which felt like highway robbery but was unavoidable. The wooden floor supports came next. 8 posts of lodgepole pine, each one 6 inches in diameter, set in the gravel sand floor at regular intervals to support the subfloor he would build above, the subfloor being the platform on which the firewood would actually rest, elevated 6 inches above the gravel to allow air circulation underneath. The posts were not sunk into the ground. He'd learned from Cornelius Brandt that sinking wood into damp ground starts the rot clock running almost immediately. Instead, he set each post on a flat stone, one of a dozen he'd dragged from Warm Springs Creek that summer, and pinned it with a wooden dowel. Not as strong as sunk posts, strong enough for the load he was asking them to carry. Captain Whitmore rode over in the 3rd week and stood at the lip of the excavation and looked down into it and was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "That's better drainage than I put under the parade ground at Fort Shaw." Halvorsen said, "I had a good reason to get it right." Whitmore nodded slowly. He said, "I see that." He didn't offer to help, but he stopped predicting failure, which was its own kind of progress. The access hatch was Halvorsen's most original engineering contribution, and it's the part of the whole system that deserves the most attention, because it's what made the difference between a storage pit and a dry storage pit. Most root cellars of the period accessed from the side. You dug into a hillside and cut a door into the earth face, or you built a separate cellar structure with an exterior door. Both of those designs had a fatal flaw for firewood storage. They exposed the entry point to the weather. An exterior cellar door, no matter how well built, leaked cold air in winter, admitted rain and snowmelt in autumn and spring, and created a condensation cycle as warm air from the cellar met cold air from outside. For root vegetables, that cycle was tolerable. For firewood, it was catastrophic because the same moisture that made the best preserved pickles made the worst preserved fuel. Halvorsen's hatch was in the floor of the cabin. A trapdoor, 30 inches by 42 inches, hinged at the north edge and fitted with a wooden handle on the south, set into the floor between the fireplace and the sleeping loft ladder. When closed, it sat flush with the surrounding floorboards, sealed along 3 edges with a strip of tightly packed horsehair caulking that he'd made himself by boiling hide scraps and mixing the resulting gelatinous mess with raw horsehair combed from Sigrid's tail. A substance that, when dry, was remarkably good at filling gaps and reasonably resistant to temperature change. The 4th edge at the hinge had a 1/4-inch gap that was the key to the whole ventilation scheme. That 1/4-inch gap was deliberate. When the cabin was heated, which in winter it was most of the time running 60 to 70 degrees, warm air sat in the upper part of the living space. Cold air, which is denser, settled toward the floor. The gap at the hatch let a slow, steady trickle of warm air fall through into the pit below. Because warm air can hold more moisture than cold air, this warm air arriving in the pit absorbed any surface moisture from the wood and from the earth walls and carried it back up through the gap and into the cabin, where it dispersed harmlessly. The net effect was a gentle passive dehumidification of the storage space, the cabin's heating system doing double duty as a wood dryer. It was, in modern engineering terms, a remarkably elegant passive heat exchange ventilation system. In 1878 Montana, it was just a Norwegian man remembering how his grandfather's floor felt warm in a way that the outside air never did. The Mandan people of the upper Missouri Valley had understood a similar principle for centuries before any European settler arrived in the region. Their earth lodges, built half submerged in the ground, used the thermal mass of the surrounding soil to regulate interior temperature and used the smoke hole at the apex of the dome to create a convective air draft that moved air through the structure continuously. The underground storage pits adjacent to Mandan villages, and there were many of them, some documented as early as the 1700s by French trappers, were positioned to take advantage of the same passive air circulation that Halvorsen was rediscovering through his own reasoning. He didn't know about the Mandan pits when he built his vault. He came to the same conclusion through a different route and arrived at something that would have been immediately recognizable to any Mandan elder. The Chinese miners working the placer claims up in the Belt Mountains had their own version of the idea. Several of them had dug lateral storage chambers into the hillsides behind their bunkhouses. Not deep enough to be true cellars, but oriented specifically to avoid direct precipitation exposure while keeping the stored fuel elevated above ground drainage. Halvorsen had seen these chambers on a supply trip to the mining district in 1876 and had filed the observation away. The convergent evolution of the idea across three completely different cultural traditions, Norwegian, Native American, Chinese immigrant, suggests that the basic principle of underground insulated fuel storage isn't a clever trick that one smart person invented. It's a solution that careful, practical people tend to arrive at independently when they're serious about surviving serious winters. If you're finding this kind of historical connection interesting, the way good ideas show up in different cultures because the problems they solve are universal, there are a lot more stories like this one on this channel. Subscribe if you haven't already. We're building a record of the practical knowledge that frontier communities developed through hard experience, and every person who subscribes helps make the case that this kind of history is worth preserving and worth telling. The walls of the excavation needed to be lined, and this was the decision that took Halvorsen the longest to work out. In Norway, his grandfather's cellar had stone walls. The farmstead had been there for generations. The walls had been built properly with cut and fitted stone. It was a permanent structure. Halvorsen didn't have cut stone. He had the limestone he'd broken for the drainage layer, but that was crushed material, not building material. He had lodgepole pine in quantity, but raw timber in contact with damp earth rots. He spent 3 evenings in early September sitting at his table with a tallow candle and a piece of paper working through his options. What he settled on was a combination. The lower 3 feet of the wall, the portion most likely to be in contact with soil moisture, he lined with Flat Creek stones, dry stacked in the style he'd learned from a Welsh stonemason named Griffith, who'd helped build the foundation of the Lewistown Mercantile. Not mortared, because mortar cracks under frost heave and a cracked mortar joint is worse than no mortar at all. Dry stacked, stone fitted tightly to stone, each course slightly overlapping the one below, with smaller stones used as chinking where the larger ones didn't meet cleanly. The upper 3 feet of the wall he lined with lodgepole pine planking, 1 inch thick with a 2-inch air gap between the planking and the raw earth behind it. That air gap was insulation, still air being one of the best insulators available to a man who doesn't have fiberglass bats. And it also allowed any moisture that bled through the earth wall to drain down the back of the planking rather than being absorbed into the wood. Piotr Szymanski helped him fit the stone for 4 days. The boy had a natural eye for it, could look at an irregular stone face and see immediately which way to rotate it to get the best fit, a skill that takes most people weeks to develop, and some people never do. His mother Marta came to look at the wall on the 2nd day and ran her hand along the fitted stone faces and said in Polish something that Halvorsen didn't understand but that Piotr translated as, "She says it's tight enough." From Marta Szymanski, that was a standing ovation. The subfloor, the raised wooden platform that would hold the firewood above the drainage gravel, went in during the last week of September. Halvorsen built it in sections, each section 2 feet by 4 feet of rough sawn pine planks laid across the lodgepole support posts with 2-inch gaps between the planks to allow air circulation from below. The sections were not fastened to each other or to the posts. He wanted them to be removable so that he could clean the gravel below and inspect the drainage system each spring. He'd seen too many permanent installations that couldn't be inspected become permanent installations that failed because nobody noticed they were failing until it was too late. Then the issue of ventilation at the top. He'd planned the 1/4-inch gap at the hatch hinge from the beginning, but as the project neared completion, he realized he needed something more. A way to move larger volumes of air through the pit during the warm months of the year when the cabin might be too hot to heat effectively and the natural convection wouldn't be running. He built a second small vent, a 4-inch square opening in the south wall of the cabin at floor level, fitted with a wooden plug that could be inserted or removed from inside. In summer, when the wood supply was being restocked and dried, he'd pull the plug and let outside air run through the hatch gap across the pit and out the south vent, creating a cross-ventilation draft that would drive the last of the moisture out of any newly split wood he was curing underground. In winter, the plug went in, and the system relied entirely on the passive heat exchange through the hatch gap. The total cost of the project in materials purchased rather than found or made was $11.30. That included the clay drainage pipe, 2 pounds of cut nails for the hatch hardware, and a bottle of linseed oil he rubbed into the pine planking to slow moisture absorption. The labor, his own and Piotr's, doesn't count in that figure, because on the frontier in 1878, labor was what you had in surplus and cash was what you had almost none of. The last board of the subfloor went in on October the 14th. Halverson pulled the hatch closed and stood in his cabin and stamped on the floor and listened to the solid sound of it. He'd been at it 64 days. He had 56 days before his intended first load date, which he'd set at the first week of December. He had a lot of wood to split. And then the rains came. October in the Judith Basin is supposed to be dry. The weather almanac that Halverson had been keeping in a ledger since 1872 showed an average of 1.3 inches of rainfall for the month of October, distributed across 4 to 6 rain events, none of them particularly intense. What the basin got in October of 1878 was 4.7 inches in 18 days, not a catastrophic amount by Eastern standards. Catastrophic by Montana standards, in October, when the temperature was swinging between 38 degrees at night and 52 degrees at midday. Warm enough to rain. Cold enough that the water had nowhere to go but into the already saturated ground. Halverson woke on the morning of October 17th to the sound of water moving inside his cabin. Not dripping, moving. He lit his lantern and opened the hatch and looked down into the pit and saw 2 inches of standing water on the subfloor boards. He stood there for a moment with the lantern in one hand and let the full weight of the situation land on him. 2 inches wasn't a disaster. Not yet. The drainage system was still there and presumably still functioning, but something had overwhelmed it. Maybe the French drain outside the north foundation had silted up. Maybe the clay pipe was blocked. Maybe the slope of the drainage channel was insufficient for the volume of water coming in. He didn't know which of the three it was yet, and until he knew, he couldn't fix it. He climbed down into the pit in his boots, the water was cold, not quite freezing, and waded to the north wall and looked at the drainage channel. The channel was clear. Water was moving in it toward the clay pipe opening, which told him the pipe itself was the problem. He pushed a long stick through the clay pipe and hit resistance at about 18 inches in, something blocking it. He worked the stick back and forth for several minutes and felt the resistance give, and then heard a gurgling rush as water began moving through the pipe again. A clot of clay and fine silt had washed into the pipe opening from outside and built up enough to create a partial blockage. Not a design failure. A maintenance failure. Something he should have anticipated and screened against. The water in the pit took 4 hours to drain completely after he cleared the pipe. He spent those 4 hours bailing with the wooden bucket he'd used to move spoil during the excavation, carrying water up the ramp and dumping it 30 feet from the cabin, moving probably 180 gallons by hand before the drainage system caught up with the bailing and the level dropped below the subfloor. By the time it was done, he was soaked to the thighs and exhausted, and his hands were shaking with cold, and he sat at his table with a cup of hot coffee and thought about what Cornelius Brandt had said about men who knew what they were doing. He screened the pipe opening that afternoon. A piece of fine mesh hardware cloth. He had a small roll of it that he'd bought in Lewistown for screening his flour bin against mice, cut to fit over the pipe opening and held in place with a flat stone. He dug out the French drain channel alongside the pipe and found that it had partially collapsed on one side, narrowing the drainage area. He spent 3 hours rebuilding it and packing the surrounding soil more firmly. He installed a second drainage observation point, a vertical pipe of bamboo he'd saved from a crate, 8 inches tall, positioned at the low corner of the drainage channel so that he could check the water level in the drainage system without opening the hatch, simply by looking at whether there was standing water in the bamboo pipe visible through a small gap in the cabin floor. He drilled with a brace and bit. Captain Whitmore came by the following week, and Halverson showed him the bamboo observation pipe and the screened drain outlet and explained what had happened. Whitmore looked at all of it for a long time and then said, "In the Army, we call that a field modification." He paused. "Usually, the first design has problems. The good engineers fix them. The bad ones argue that the problems don't exist." Halverson said, "My grandfather would have called it learning." Whitmore almost smiled. He said, "Your grandfather sounds like he would have made a decent officer." The rain stopped on the 22nd of October and didn't return. The drainage system performed flawlessly for the rest of the autumn and through every subsequent winter. The bamboo observation pipe never showed standing water after the modifications. The design had been tested in the worst possible way, by failure, and had come out the other side better for it. The first load of firewood went into the vault on November the 30th, 5 days ahead of schedule, because the first hard freeze hit on the 28th and Halverson wanted to get the wood in before the ground around the cabin froze solid and started putting pressure on the drainage system. He'd been splitting and stacking wood outside since mid-October. 2 cords of lodgepole pine split to 4-inch widths for maximum drying surface, stacked in a row that ran along the south side of the cabin where the afternoon sun hit it, and the prevailing south wind ran across it. 6 weeks of Montana autumn had dried that wood to somewhere around 18 to 20% moisture content. Not bone dry, that would take longer, but dry enough to handle safely. The real drying would happen underground, in the passive ventilated vault over the winter. He carried the wood down through the hatch in armloads, stacking it on the subfloor planks in a pattern he'd worked out in advance. Split faces out with 1-inch gaps between each piece to allow the air to circulate, the pile built in a crisscross pattern. 4 pieces running north-south, then 4 pieces running east-west, alternating layers up to 5 feet high. The crisscross pattern was old. Scandinavian woodcutters had used it for generations because it creates structural stability in the pile without needing any external support, and because it maximizes airflow through the stack, and because this was the part Halvorsen had worked out for himself. When you build it crisscross, every piece has at least 2 points of air contact on each of its 4 sides, which means the drying is even rather than concentrated on the exposed faces only. 2 cords of lodgepole stacked crisscross filled about 3/4 of the vault. He had room for another half cord, which he'd add in late November if his splitting stayed ahead of the cold. He lowered the last armload, climbed back up and closed the hatch. Then he stood in his cabin and listened to the weather moving in from the north and allowed himself, for the first time in 131 days since he'd started planning, to feel something that wasn't worry. Take a moment here if you would. What Halvorsen built is remarkable not just as a practical solution to a very specific problem, but as an example of a kind of intelligence that the frontier required and rewarded. The ability to sit with a problem for 4 years, to consult people who disagreed with you and actually listen to them, to test your design against reality and fix it when it failed, and to do all of that alone or nearly so, without access to engineering textbooks or professional advice or any of the resources we take for granted today. If you found this story worth your time, please like this video. Every like tells us that this kind of careful, detailed historical storytelling is what you want to see more of, and we'll keep making it. The winter of 1878-79 settled over the Judith Basin the way bad winters do in Montana. Not with one dramatic assault, but with a slow, grinding accumulation of cold and isolation that wore at people the way water wears at stone. November brought 22 inches of snow. December added another 16. The temperature dropped to 15 below zero in the last week of December and didn't come back up for 9 days. Halvorsen kept the cabin at 62 degrees on the coldest nights, burning wood from the vault, and he kept a log of everything. Temperature inside the cabin, temperature outside, number of pieces of wood burned per day, moisture content of the wood as he split test pieces to check the grain. He had a simple moisture test he'd worked out himself. If a fresh split piece hissed and popped and sent steam off the cut face when laid near the fire, it was above 25% moisture. If it lay quiet and caught readily, it was below 20%. If it caught almost instantly and produced a small clear flame rather than a yellow smoky one, it was below 15%. Genuinely dry, the good burning stuff that gave off maximum heat. By late December, 6 weeks into the cold, the wood he was pulling from the vault was testing below 15% on his hiss test. Not 18 to 20% as it had gone in. Below 15. The passive ventilation was working. The warm air dropping through the hatch gap was drawing moisture out of the wood and carrying it up into the cabin, where it dissipated harmlessly. The wood was getting drier as winter deepened, not wetter. It was doing the opposite of every exposed woodpile in the Judith Basin. He took some measurements in early January that he recorded carefully in his ledger. On a morning when the outside temperature was 22 below zero, he opened the hatch and lowered a thermometer into the vault on a string and let it sit for 10 minutes. The vault temperature was 44 degrees Fahrenheit, 66 degrees warmer than the outside air. The stable thermal mass of the surrounding earth was holding steady, absorbing the extreme cold above and insulating the stored wood from it. The wood in the vault was sitting in a 44-degree low humidity environment in the middle of a Montana winter. It was, in terms of storage conditions, almost indistinguishable from a warm September day. The wood couldn't tell the difference. It just kept slowly, steadily giving up its remaining moisture to the moving air and getting drier. The traditional exposed woodpile, meanwhile, was cycling between frozen solid overnight and thawing slightly on warm afternoons, with every freeze-thaw cycle forcing water deeper into the wood grain and making the fuel worse, not better. A comparison Halvorsen made later in his ledger, after the thaw when he was able to split and test a piece from his outdoor backup pile, showed that the vault wood was running at 13 to 14% moisture content while the outdoor pile was running at 26 to 28%. Underground versus traditional exposed stack equaled roughly 45 to 50% lower moisture content. In practical terms, that meant the vault wood produced about 30% more usable heat per piece because less of the combustion energy was being wasted evaporating water out of wet grain. Halverson was getting a third again as much heat from the same amount of wood. In a Montana winter, a third again as much heat is the difference between a cabin at 62 degrees and a cabin at 42 degrees. And 42 degrees versus 62 degrees is in certain circumstances the difference between frostbite and no frostbite, between a sick child and a healthy one, between survival and something else. The blizzard that came on the 3rd of January 1879, the same one that trapped the Hartley family, had been predicted by nobody because in 1878 there was no weather service to predict it. What the ranchers and settlers in the Judith Basin knew was that a dark line had been building on the northern horizon since late the previous afternoon, and that the temperature, which had been a relatively mild 10 degrees above zero on the 2nd of January, had dropped to -8 by midnight and was still dropping. Those were the signs. Some people read them correctly and spent the night of the 2nd adding extra wood to their stoves and banking the fire for a long burn. Others went to sleep as normal and woke up to a world that had changed completely. Halverson was in the second category. He went to bed on the night of January the 2nd with a good fire going and 2 days' worth of vault wood stacked beside the fireplace and didn't wake until 6 in the morning when something, a change in the sound of the wind, an intuition that the man who's been through enough Montana winters eventually develops in the same way that fishermen develop a feel for weather, made him get up and light his lantern. The thermometer outside the south window read 34 below zero. The wind was running at something close to 40 miles an hour, driving snow horizontally across the window glass in a way that made the outside world look like the inside of a river. The sky was the color of old pewter from horizon to horizon. It was, by any reasonable standard, one of the worst mornings he'd seen in 8 years in Montana. He added 2 pieces of vault wood to the fire and put the coffee pot on and sat at the table with his ledger and thought about his neighbors. The Hartleys were 6 miles southwest. August Hartley was a good man and a hard worker. But he was 3 years on his claim and he hadn't yet learned the specific way that Montana cold could surprise you, the way it could go from manageable to lethal in the time between one morning and the next. Halverson thought about the Hartley woodpile. He'd seen it in November, a good-sized stack of green pine that hadn't been undercover, and he thought about the 2 little girls, and he thought about the way Dora Hartley had looked at the woodpile when he'd been over for Sunday dinner in October. A quick worried glance that she probably didn't know he'd noticed. He got up and put on his heaviest wool coat and his sealskin mitts and his Norwegian wool cap with the ear flaps and went out to the lean-to and spent 20 minutes harnessing Sigrid in the dark and the blowing snow. The horse warm and patient and absolutely certain that whatever was about to happen was going to be unpleasant. He loaded the sledge with 230 pounds of vault wood, dry 14% the good stuff, by lantern light. He threw a canvas tarp over the load and lashed it down. He went inside and drank his coffee, all of it, and ate a cold biscuit and checked the fire and banked it properly. And then he drove 6 miles through a 38 below blizzard in a wind that drove snow into the gap between his collar and his cap and found ways to make him cold despite everything he was wearing. He found the Hartley cabin dark, no smoke from the chimney. He hammered on the door and said what he said. And August Hartley opened the door and Halverson carried the first armload of vault wood through the door and started the fire. Later, when the fire was going and the cabin was warming and the coffee was on, August Hartley sat across the table from him and asked the question, "Where did you get dry wood like that in January?" And Halverson told him, "Under my floor." And he watched the expression move across Hartley's face, disbelief and then curiosity, and then something that settled into a kind of focused attention that Halverson recognized as the look of a man who has just understood something important and is deciding what to do with the understanding. Hartley said, "How long did it take you to build it?" Halverson said 120 days. Hartley said, "Could you help me build one?" By the following autumn, the fall of 1879, there were 4 under-cabin wood vaults operating in the Judith Basin. Halverson's was the original. Hartley built one over the summer of 1879 with Halverson's help and Piotr Szymanski's muscle, slightly larger than the original at 14 by 16 feet, with a modified drainage system that incorporated a second clay pipe outlet to handle the heavier rainfall that the south-facing slope of the Hartley claim received. Marta Szymanski built one under her own cabin with her 2 sons doing the excavation, and Marta herself designing the stone lining after spending 3 evenings at Halverson's place studying his walls and asking questions that were so precise and specific that Halverson found himself hard-pressed to answer all of them. She improved on his design. Her stone lining went all the way to the ceiling of the vault, not just the lower 3 feet, and she used a flat capstone fitted into the wall at the top of each course that deflected water dripping from the cabin floor framing before it could reach the wood below. It was a better idea than his. He told her so. She said, "You thought of everything underneath. I just thought of one thing above." The 4th vault was built by Captain Whitmore, who had spent the summer after the January blizzard thinking about the experience of driving past the Hartley cabin in February and seeing the woodpile, frozen solid, every stick of it coated in ice, and knowing what it had felt like the previous winter to be the only man within 6 miles with warm enough firewood to share. He didn't want that responsibility again. He built his vault in August of 1879, spent 94 days on it, and ended up with the deepest and most carefully engineered of the 4. 7 feet deep rather than 6, with a ventilation system that incorporated not 1 but 2 floor-level vents on opposite sides of the cabin, creating a more reliable cross-draft. He sent a letter to Halverson when it was done that said in full, "The drainage is better than Fort Shaw. The wood, I am told, will be dry by December. I have no further objections to raise." Coming from Captain Randolph Whitmore, that was a standing ovation and a brass band combined. Pastor Drummond came to see Halverson in October of 1879, after the work was done and before the snow came, and sat at the same table where Halverson had sat with August Hartley on that January morning. He said, "I told you to count the cost." He paused. "I didn't say the cost was too high." Halverson poured him coffee and said, "No, you didn't." Drummond said, "I've been thinking about what you did for the Hartleys." He was quiet for a moment. "There's a kind of preparation that looks like fear, like you don't trust that things will be all right. And there's a kind of preparation that looks like love, like you want to make sure the people you care about will be warm." He wrapped his hands around the coffee cup. "I don't think I always knew the difference. In the winter of 1879-80, all 4 vaults performed. The Judith Basin got its 2nd hard winter in a row. Not as dramatic as the January blizzard of 1879, but persistent and grinding, with 6 weeks of consecutive below-zero temperatures in January and February, and a late snowstorm in March that caught 3 families in the valley unprepared. The 4 families with vaults shared wood with 2 of those families. They had enough to share. They had enough because they'd built something that preserved what they'd put into it, that used the intelligence of the earth itself, its thermal stability, its insulating capacity, to protect their fuel supply from the weather that every winter on the Montana frontier turned good intentions into frozen wood piles and frozen wood piles into genuine emergencies. The specific numbers from that 2nd winter tell the story as clearly as any narrative could. The Hartley vault, holding 2.5 cords of split lodgepole that had gone in at 20% moisture in early November, was producing wood that tested at 11 to 12% by mid-January. The outdoor backup pile Hartley kept, he'd insisted on maintaining one in case something went wrong underground, tested at 31%. Vault wood versus outdoor wood, 62% less moisture in the stored fuel. And at 62% lower moisture content, that wood was burning at essentially its maximum theoretical efficiency, producing so little smoke that Dora Hartley told her husband the chimney must be broken because she could look up and see the sky clearly through it on a still day. It wasn't broken. The wood was just that dry. Cornelius Brandt came to see Halverson in the spring of 1880, a social call, and spent a long time examining the vault through the open hatch before pulling himself back up to the cabin floor. He said, "I'm going to build one." Halverson said, "I know you are." Brandt said, "I should have helped you in the first place." Halverson said, "You helped. You made me think harder about the foundation." Brandt was quiet for a moment, running his thumb along the edge of the hatch frame, checking the joinery the way a man who'd spent 30 years in wood couldn't help doing. Then he said, "Good fit on the horsehair seal." He paused. "I wouldn't have thought of horsehair." "Neither would I," Halverson said. "Sigrid thought of it. Indirectly." Brandt looked at him for a moment and then made a sound that, in a German-American carpenter who'd been on the frontier since 1866, passed for laughter. The vault that Eric Halverson built under his cabin in the autumn of 1878 stood for 31 years until a fire in 1909 took the cabin above it. The excavation survived the fire, as excavations tend to do, and the new cabin built on the site used the same pit, still with its original stone lining and its lodgepole support posts, which were found to be in sound condition despite 3 decades of use. The man who rebuilt the cabin, a young rancher named Thomas Olerud, the son of a Norwegian immigrant who'd settled in the basin in the 1880s, told anyone who asked that the pit was the reason his family chose that particular quarter section. Not the creek access, not the south-facing slope, the pit. The principle that Halvorsen demonstrated in 1878 has been validated repeatedly by modern studies in passive building science. Research on earth-sheltered structures consistently finds that soil temperature at 6 feet below grade in Montana and similar climates stabilize between 42 and 54 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, nearly identical to what Halvorsen measured and recorded in his ledger. Studies of wood moisture content have confirmed that the combination of stable temperature, passive air exchange through a heated space above, and protection from precipitation can reduce firewood moisture to below 15% within 60 to 90 days of storage, compared to the 6 to 12 months required for surface drying in exposed conditions. The specific numbers vary. The principle is consistent. The earth is a better storage medium than the air above it, and frontier settlers in Montana in 1878 figured that out the same way they figured out most things worth knowing, through necessity, through observation, and through the stubbornness to keep working on a problem until the problem was solved. What's remarkable, looking back at the record Halvorsen kept in his ledger, 47 pages of temperature readings and moisture observations and structural notes and weather records currently archived at the Montana Historical Society in Helena, is how carefully he attended to what didn't work. The drainage failure in October 1878, the silt that blocked the clay pipe, the inadequate support posts that had to be reset when 2 of them shifted slightly in the first spring thaw. He recorded all of it. He didn't edit his mistakes out of the record. He left them in because he understood, in the way that practical men often understand without being able to articulate it in the language of engineering or science, that the failures were as important as the successes. That the pipe blockage, recorded and repaired and screened against, was information that his neighbors could use when they built their own vaults. That the shifted post, documented and reset with a better stone base, was knowledge that would prevent the same problem for the next person who built a similar structure. He was, in other words, keeping a manual. Not because he planned to publish it or present it to anyone, because writing it down was how he honored the work. There's a question worth sitting with here at the end of this story. Erik Halvorsen spent 120 days, 4 full months, on a project that most of his neighbors thought was unnecessary, technically risky, or at minimum a misuse of time that could have been spent on more immediate priorities. He faced legitimate objections from people whose experience and judgment he respected. He watched his design fail partway through in the worst possible conditions, and he fixed it and kept going. He crossed 6 miles of blizzard in January to bring dry wood to a family that didn't yet know how much they needed it. None of that required a particular genius. It required the specific combination of qualities that the frontier seemed to select for: patience and observation, and the willingness to sit with a problem long enough to understand it properly before picking up a shovel. Those qualities are not unique to the 1870s or to Montana or to Norwegian immigrants. They're available to any person who decides to exercise them. What frontier communities like the one in the Judith Basin had that we often lack is a very clear feedback loop. The ideas that were wrong killed people, or ruined crops, or froze livestock. The ideas that were right became the knowledge that survived and got passed on. There was no ambiguity about which was which. That clarity was brutal, and it was also clarifying in a way that made the knowledge that came out of it very clean, very tested, and very real. The under-cabin wood vault is a real thing. It was built by real people who needed it to be real. The 44-degree temperature Halvorsen measured in his vault on a 34 below January morning was not a theory or a calculation. It was a fact about the earth that he'd put himself in a position to observe, by being willing to dig 6 feet down into it and wait and pay attention. The wood that he carried through that blizzard to the Hartley cabin was dry because he'd spent 120 days making sure it would be. Not hoping. Not trusting to luck. Making sure. That's the knowledge worth preserving. Not just the technique, though the technique is real and it works, but the disposition that produces the technique. The willingness to think ahead for winters. The willingness to listen to Cornelius Brandt and Marta Szymanski and Randolph Whitmore and Elias Drummond and take their objections seriously and let those objections make the design better. The willingness to write down the failure alongside the success, because both of them are the knowledge and both of them belong to whoever comes next and needs to know. If this channel exists to do one thing, it exists to do that. To take the knowledge that frontier families earned through hard experience and hard winters and record it before the last threads connecting us to that experience are gone. Stories like Halvorsen's don't survive by accident. They survive because someone decides they're worth telling, and someone else decides they're worth listening to. And together they make a record. If you've listened this far, you've already decided. Thank you for that. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't. Join the community of people who think that what Halverson knew, what Marta Szymanski knew, what Dora Hartley knew from the look of a frozen woodpile, is worth knowing still. Help us keep documenting it. There are more stories where this one came from, more forgotten techniques, more names that deserve to be remembered, more winters that were survived by people who thought harder and worked longer and cared more than they had any particular obligation to. We'll keep telling them as long as you keep showing up to hear them. The wood was wet once. Then a man spent 120 days making sure it wouldn't be again. And on a January morning at 38 below zero, that was the whole difference in the world.